I've had the good fortune to be translated by a wonderful Argentinian poet, Jorge Fondebrider, whom I met 15, 16 years ago in Argentina. And he's a wonderful translator, and I was just very, very fortunate that he asked if he could translate my work. And it was eventually published in Valencia. So quite a long time ago, about in 2013, I was just checking recently. So yeah, no, my Spanish certainly is very basic now. It wouldn't be up to that at all. No, I think poetry and jokes are the two last things you will understand in a second language.
Definitely.
Because they depend so much on context and nuance that I wouldn't even dare to. I still have enormous difficulty in reading Spanish poetry, although it was the reason that I started to learn Spanish, really, to have access to this vast literature. But I'll get there. I will get there. Neruda and Machado. Machado, I got when I was maybe a late teenager, maybe in 16, 17. A brother very kindly at various stages gave me copies of Neruda's Captain's Verses, and I'm trying to think, Michael Smith was a translator of a collection of Machado's poetry. And you know, there's some poets that you just light you up when you're young, and there's some who do that, but they keep lighting you up all your life. And certainly Machado, I've taught students at various stages, and they all relate to Neruda's work. It's a great poetry for the young and for those who are beginning to write. I don't like it quite as much now. I mean, I have huge respect for it, but Machado would bring me through life, I think. And I was fortunate enough a number of years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, I was delighted to be invited to a festival in Soria. So that was a real, real treat, you know, Machado's Soria and the Duero. There's a lovely sonority and about Spanish poetry, which has almost always drawn me, not dreamlike at all, but I mean, again, Neruda's, the wealth of his imagery is incredible and very, very unlike anything which we would have in Ireland. But I'm not quite sure, actually. I just don't know. There's a strange atmosphere that comes with every language, I suppose, creates its own atmosphere. And that's why I think, you know, each society, because we're such a bundle of contradictions as human beings, and each society will cultivate certain sides of our nature and repress others. And I think that is why, when you're young, it's marvellous to encounter the poetry of another language where different aspects of our humanity is celebrated. I mean, I felt the same encountering Russian poetry and you know, German poetry, Rilke, etc. It opens up another side of human nature to you, and that's profoundly exhilarating as a young person, and continues to be so. I mean, more recently, about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, a German neighbour introduced me to the Polish poetry. Each society will celebrate certain aspects of our human nature. And of course, the sunshine of Spain and of Latin America just shines through the poetry as well. Oh, hugely. I mean, I was very fortunate to have a very good curriculum of poetry, both in my primary and secondary school. And my mother was very, very fond of English poetry and was a great friend of an elderly poet called Alice Milligan, who would have been a contemporary of Yeats. And my father wrote poetry in Irish, so poetry was always there. And it's a great, very rich tradition, or very rich curriculum in school. And that's fantastic, but there's something about encountering poetry all on your own, you know, not having it mediated. You get the full aesthetic whack of it, you know, when you come to a poet in another language, I think, which I say is just profoundly exhilarating and refreshing, and just opens doors into other worlds, you know. My favourite quote about that comes from Michael Longley, the Irish poet. He said, "If I knew where poems come from, I'd go and live there." I don't know if any poet really, really knows, where they come from. It's how can I say it? When I left college in the mid-70s, and I thought I'd lived in Dublin for maybe 5 or 6 years, and it was a couple of years afterwards I started to write in my 20s. I didn't write all my life, as many people do. And I thought I'd be writing very urban, edgy, political poetry. But when I sat down, all the imagery that came to me was from the landscape in which I grew up, the mountains and the seas. Those were the metaphors which came to me. Maybe that's why I was drawn to people like Neruda, because he has that kind of imagery as well. And so, I mean, I've been writing since I started. I have the same preoccupations, I'm afraid. I'm really interested in music. At the same time I started to write, I tried to play music, but, after 20 years, I wasn't getting much better, so I put that aside and decided to be a good listener. I'm interested in, as I say, the imagery that comes to me is very much associated with the landscapes and seascapes of Donegal and Galway and the Burren. I spent most of my adult life in Galway. I've always been interested in archaeology and also in geology. And I'm planning now in my next incarnation to be either an archaeologist or a geologist, but I haven't decided which yet.
Good.
Yeah.
You have time.
I will. Let's hope. Let's hope. Let's hope. But the process, I don't know. Poetry comes from everywhere. I mean, sometimes it's like something. I was trying, for instance, to write something the other day. I mean, this last week about the terrible events that happened in XI and Donegal. Sometimes it's something overwhelming like that. Sometimes, I mean, when I started to write first, I thought, poetry happens where the head and the heart, at the crossroads where the head and the heart meet. It's emotion, but emotion isn't enough without ideas. And then later I thought, well, no, poetry is an expression of the human spirit, And when you ask, if you were to ask, how does a poem start? It could be just an image that stays with you, something that moves you deeply in one way or another, really. And what I do is I just eventually get around to sitting down, and the most important thing I tell students is, somebody said, apply seat of pants to seat of chair. Sit down and give it the time, and just start to write down ideas, anything, images that come to you. And you're not always receptive, but very often you are, and one idea will lead to another. And then that's the raw material. Those are the building blocks. They're not a poem, Or if it's a very deep emotional experience, sometimes you just spit out your emotion. And again, that's the raw material, but it's not a poem, because nobody has the slightest interest in what I feel about anything, none at all. But as readers, we are very selfish. We want to see our own thoughts reflected. So then you take that raw material and you somehow translate it into imagery and rhythm. And then that's a kind of a courtesy, because other people can see that image, feel that rhythm, and they can feel their own emotion through it, if the poem is successful. It isn't always, of course, But I think that is why, people say, is poetry translatable? I think there are things which can't be translated, obviously, puns and all kinds of things, but it's the fact that you're dealing with imagery. That's a kind of an Esperanto, if you render the image well, I think. Well, it's profoundly enriching, absolutely, in the same way that meeting the cultures of other countries is always enriching, I think, and it just jolts you out of your overfamiliar rut. I've had the good fortune to be invited abroad many times, and many times to Latin America. And it's always just so exciting, and just all those different worlds, and to realise the different sensibilities of different countries, Colombia and Argentina and Chile. When we were students in the early 70s, was just saying that to the lovely young singer yesterday, that we heard the music of Cuila Payún and of Violeta Parra, etc. And I mean, I remember hearing Violeta Parra's song Volver a los 17 años. I hadn't a word of Spanish, but just even through the translation, I was so moved by it. And it's just wonderful to encounter the sensibilities of other cultures. Un placer.